Let's now bring in Kethevane Gorjestani, our foreign affairs editor. Thanks for joining me on set, Kethevane. So, of course, France has in the past stuck its neck out where its allies have not. Is this another one of these moments?
Well, look, France has been sort of hinting at this move for a few months now, and Emmanuel Macron now making that pretty much official. So if France does go through with it, it is pretty significant. It is symbolic because it's not going to change much. But the fact is that, as you said, it would be the only G7 country, probably the only major Western power to actually do that recognition. And unsurprisingly, you're seeing the sort of usual suspects condemning that. The Israelis, obviously, as you said, calling it a reward for a terror, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that it would be the statehood would be a launch pad to annihilate Israel. The United States is pretty much alone in outright publicly condemning this move by Emmanuel Macron, Secretary of State Marco Rubio calling it a reckless decision and a slap in the face towards the victims of October 7th. But otherwise, what you're seeing is that countries around the world, there are already more than 140 of them who recognize Palestine, have been praising Emmanuel Macron, saying it's a step in the right direction. Obviously, that's true of the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, that's true of many Arab countries in the Middle East. But as you said, Europeans have also praised that move, like the Spaniards, who were part of a group of European countries last year to make that move. And Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, adding that this was to be celebrated and that together we must protect what Netanyahu is trying to destroy. So what you're seeing is that Emmanuel Macron's move is sort of adding to the growing list of countries that were once staunch supporters of Israel, who are starting to move beyond that and to move towards more support for Palestinian statehood. One other thing is that the French are also lobbying other countries, especially in Europe, to sort of take that same journey. And the first one that we're going to be looking at is, of course, the UK, with Keir Starmer's comment just yesterday saying that a ceasefire will put us on a path to the recognition of a Palestinian state. That would also be very significant, and it seems that the French and other European countries like Spain and Ireland are heavily lobbying for other countries to follow suit.
Yeah, because in the last 24 hours or so, we've had different kinds of statements from Canada, Australia and the UK, as you mentioned there, condemning the famine specifically. But they're choosing to do this now, presumably because of what France has just decided to do.
Yes. What you're seeing is that these are two separate issues. There's the statehood and there's the question of the humanitarian suffering and the famine in Gaza. But what this paints as a picture as a whole is the increasing isolation of Israel when it comes to what is happening in Gaza. You've got increasing diplomatic pressure, increasing public pressure from countries, again, like France, like the UK, like Canada, who were very much supporters of Israel for a very long time and who are now no longer shying away from outright criticizing Israel. And some of the statements are pretty clear. Keir Starmer in that same statement saying that the suffering and starvation unfolding in Gaza is unspeakable, indefensible. Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and the German Chancellor are going to be holding an emergency call to try to figure out how to get more aid in to Gaza and how to end the war. But if you take some of the comments, for example, of the Canadian Prime Minister, he said that the denial of humanitarian aid is a violation of international law. The Australian Prime Minister that says that what is happening cannot be defended, cannot be ignored. Just days ago, you had that statement signed by 30 foreign ministers, largely European countries, but also Canada, Australia, Japan, Japan, who were calling for the end of the war and especially calling for humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. Again, of course, all of this is very symbolic. Statements are not going to feed those children that we're seeing on these images, but it does show that Israel right now, at least publicly and vocally, basically has the United States in their camp. Everybody else, even countries like Germany, who don't usually say anything critical of Israel. Yes, they didn't sign the statement, but you have even the Germans starting to be very uncomfortable in sort of defending what Israel is doing when it comes to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And so the question now is whether the symbolic pressure on Israel is going to move forward into something a little bit more concrete. Some countries have started taking small sanctions against certain figures in Israel. But of course, here in the European Union, there's this question of halting the sort of association agreement of bringing in new sanctions. And that is where the people who believe that Israel is not going to answer to statements want to see some movement, actually concrete things like sanctions to put pressure on Israel to actually open up at least the flow of humanitarian aid for the Palestinian people.
The most obvious way to get a large flow of humanitarian aid in is through a ceasefire. Where are we at with those negotiations?
Well, those negotiations, unfortunately, are stalled at the best. That's seeing it in a positive light because, of course, the American delegation pulled out of these talks a little bit early. Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy to try to get that ceasefire, pulling out of those talks. The Americans blaming, it seems, solely Hamas for not being able to go forward with these talks. The Israelis, of course, also blaming Hamas, but seemingly saying that they're willing to continue the talks. The problem in the situation is that neither side is budging on a sort of the main sticking point that has prevented a ceasefire for all this time, which is what is the end of the war and when does it happen? Of course, Hamas wants to have an end of the war and assurances from the United States that Israel is not just going to be picking up the war whenever it wants, before it sort of releases all of the remaining hostages, before it sort of comes into this real ceasefire, while the Israelis are saying, no, we want the hostages out, all of them, and we want Hamas to lay down their weapons and disband before we even consider a full-time ceasefire. And there you absolutely see no movement. And while all of these delegations are talking and getting stuck on the same point, you have dozens of people dying every day in Gaza while Hamas, Israel, and the U.S. try to figure out how they can get to a ceasefire.
Kethevane, Gorjestani, thanks for that.